I am optimistic. I'm generally a very optimistic person. Yeah, I think stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. Worry.
The dinner had been designed to look effortless. The silver had been polished until it caught the candlelight like still water. The flowers had been arranged low enough for conversation, but rich enough to signal importance. Every place card had been measured, every chair aligned, every course timed to the minute. It was meant to be one of those royal evenings that reassures a country without saying a word. The kind of palace gathering where tradition does the talking and the family simply appears to embody it. But then Prince William looked up, saw who had just entered the room at Camilla's side, and everything stopped. Not loudly, not publicly, not in a way that would have caused a scene for the cameras outside. That was what made it so chilling. He did not slam a glass down. He did not call anyone out across the table. He simply froze. And in a royal household, where movement itself is ritual and composure is currency, a freeze from the heir to the throne can be more alarming than an outburst. Because when the future king goes still in the middle of a state-level family dinner, every person in that room understands the same thing at once. Something had gone very wrong. Before we go deeper into what this really meant for William, for Camilla, and for the fragile balance inside the palace, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update, because this was not just an awkward social moment. It was a private shock with public consequences, and those consequences would spread far beyond a dining room before the night was over. At first glance, the guest did not seem like someone who should have caused a constitutional tremor. He was not a foreign head of state. He was not a disgraced politician. He was not a tabloid photographer sneaking through a service corridor. The danger was subtler than that, and therefore far more serious. The man who entered under Camilla's quiet protection was a figure from an older world of palace compromise, private negotiation, and deeply buried loyalties. He had once been close enough to the household to know where the soft spots were. He had once been trusted enough to hear what was never intended for public ears. And William had been led to believe that his access to royal spaces had ended. That mattered, because royal exile is rarely announced with drums. Sometimes it happens through silence, unanswered invitations, and the simple fact that a door is no longer opened. For years, this man had belonged to the outer edge of that silent category, not formally disgraced, but no longer welcome near the center. His presence at that dinner meant one thing immediately. Someone with real authority had allowed old boundaries to be crossed. And because he had arrived with Camilla, the implication was even harder to ignore. The country saw a royal dinner on the calendar. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. William did not merely see an unwelcome face. He saw the possible return of a network he believed had already done enough damage. He saw the faint outline of an older style of palace politics, one built not on clarity but on private channels, managed loyalties, and carefully chosen intermediaries. He saw, in an instant, that the evening was no longer about hospitality. It had become a test of trust. Those close enough to observe him later said, the change in his expression was immediate, not theatrical, not exaggerated. Worse than that, controlled. His hand, which had been resting near his glass, stayed there a moment too long. His shoulders locked, he did not greet the guest. He did not move to smooth over the discomfort for others. Catherine, seated close enough to understand the shift without a word being spoken, reportedly turned slightly toward him, and knew at once that whatever had just happened was not minor. She had seen him angry before. This was different. Anger can be managed. This was recognition. Camilla, according to those familiar with the room's atmosphere, realized almost instantly that William had seen the man and understood exactly who he was. Yet she did not retreat. That may have been the most revealing detail of all. She continued forward, her expression composed, her posture unchanged, as if to signal that the guest's presence was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, and certainly not a matter to be handled with embarrassed apologies at the threshold. It was a decision, her decision, or one she had chosen to carry. In either case, William read it as deliberate. King Charles saw the freeze a second later. People often misunderstand how these moments unfold inside royal spaces. They imagine shouting, confrontation, and spectacle. But spectacle is the one thing such families are trained to avoid at almost any cost. What happens instead is more dangerous. Signals pass in silence. One face closes. Another stiffens. A conversation half started at the end of the table dies mid-sentence, because everyone can feel the current shift under the polished surface. That was the atmosphere now. Candles flickered. Cutlery remained in perfect alignment, and the air in the room changed completely. The dinner had been intended, at least on paper, as a restoration evening. That was the phrase some staff used privately. A restoration evening was not an official constitutional term. It was palace shorthand for an event meant to project steadiness after a period of whispering strain. There had been too many stories lately, too many small signs of internal distance, too many moments where the household felt less like one court and more like several guarded islands sharing the same walls. This dinner was supposed to calm that feeling. Instead, within seconds, it exposed just how fragile the calm had become. What happened next mattered, because William did something that people in his position almost never do in such a setting. He delayed the room, not with an announcement, but with absence of movement. The seating sequence was waiting for him. In royal dining, sequence is discipline. If the principal figures do not move, the room does not settle. And William did not move. For several long seconds, he remained where he was, facing not the table, but the guest. No one raised a voice, but the silence deepened so sharply that even the staff at the edges understood service could not begin. The secret guest, for his part, did not look surprised to be recognized. That detail would haunt the night afterward. He seemed almost prepared for discomfort, as if the possibility of causing it had already been priced into his arrival. He gave the kind of cautious half-bow one reserves for rooms where welcome cannot be assumed. But he did not leave. He remained at Camilla's side, and in that choice lay the entire insult as William experienced it. This was not an accidental overlap in a corridor. It was placement. Only after Charles stepped forward and quietly said William's name did the air finally move. Those who later heard fragments of the account described that movement as colder than anger. He inclined his head once, not to the guest, but to his father, then turned and took his place. That was all. Yet everyone in the room understood that the evening had split in two. There was the dinner, as it had been planned, and there was the dinner after William had seen Camilla's secret guest. What made the moment even more explosive was not simply the guest's identity, but the long private history behind him. But to understand why William froze, and why the presence of one man could darken an entire royal evening, the story did not begin at that table. It began months earlier, in a quieter dispute that never made headlines but left scars inside the household. At the center of that earlier dispute was access. Access in palace life is not casual. It is hierarchy made invisible. It determines who gets briefed, who gets heard, who gets invited before decisions are final, and who can shape the mood around the sovereign without ever appearing in a photograph. The man at Camilla's side that night had once belonged to that world. He was not merely a social acquaintance. He was a discreet operator, one of those palace-adjacent figures who thrive in the gray areas between friendship, advice, and influence. Years earlier, during a particularly sensitive period of household adjustment, he had been useful to Camilla. He understood the older codes. He knew which anxieties mattered to which courtiers. He knew how to soften opposition without confronting it directly. In another era, such a person might have been called loyal. In a newer era, increasingly shaped by William's sharper instincts about boundaries and optics, he looked like a liability. The trouble was not that he knew too much. It was that he knew too much and still believed he should be able to use it. The break had come after a ceremonial dispute that seemed trivial to outsiders and explosive to those inside. A ceremonial dispute is never only about chairs, order, or invitations. It is about the meaning behind those things. On that occasion, the guest had reportedly been involved in passing along assumptions about future precedents, assumptions that placed Camilla's evolving role in a stronger position than William's team considered acceptable. It was not an official directive. That was exactly the problem. It was influence without accountability. When William learned how far those assumptions had traveled, he reacted with unusual force. He did not accuse Camilla publicly. He did not embarrass Charles. He did something more decisive. He insisted that informal intermediaries had no place in questions touching succession optics, household order, or the visible shape of the monarchy's future. Succession optics are the public signals that show where power is heading. even before power formally changes hands. William understood them intensely. He always had. For him, ambiguity was not kindness. It was risk. The guest was gradually pushed out after that. Invitations stopped. Briefing circles narrowed. Friendly contacts dried up. No statement was issued, because palaces prefer erasure to spectacle. But the message had been unmistakable. Whatever his former usefulness, he was no longer considered safe around the sensitive architecture of the next reign. William believed that chapter had closed. Catherine believed it too. Even Charles, though reluctant to dramatize the matter, had allowed the distance to remain. That was why the dinner shock landed so hard. It was not just that a difficult man had reappeared. It was that he had reappeared through a door William thought had already been sealed. The decision to bring him back, even for one evening, did not arise from nowhere. The truth was more complicated and more painful. Camilla had been feeling the walls narrow around her for months, not in obvious ways. No one had insulted her. No formal humiliation had taken place. Her title remained. Her place beside the king remained. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. Certain conversations no longer reached her first. Several future-facing initiatives were now being coordinated more tightly with the Wales household. Charitable visibility was being recalibrated. Ceremonial thinking had become more structured, less flexible, more conscious of the coming era. This was not exile. It was limitation. And limitation inside royal life can feel more suffocating than outright rejection, because it leaves you present enough to see what is being quietly taken away. Camilla understood the signals. She understood that the palace was moving into a stage where future clarity mattered more than older accommodations. She also understood that much of that tightening had William's fingerprints on it, even when his name never appeared in a memo. So when talk began of a private dinner intended to restore ease between the senior branches of the family, Camilla made a decision of her own. She would not arrive merely as a passive participant in someone else's version of calm. She would bring someone who, in her mind, represented memory, loyalty, and an older understanding of how this family survived pressure. To her, perhaps, the guest was not a threat. He was proof that she would not be quietly boxed into a narrower future, without at least reminding the room that she had not reached her place alone. If that was her thinking, it was emotionally understandable and institutionally disastrous. No one can say with certainty whether Charles knew the guest would be present before that final hour. Accounts differ, as they always do in palace stories. Some suggest he was informed late and judged that reversing the arrangement would create more tension than allowing it to proceed. Others believe he knew earlier but underestimated how deeply William would react. Both possibilities point to the same truth. Charles misjudged the gravity of what the guest represented to his son. The king's position was miserable from the outset. He had spent much of his public life trapped between private loyalties and institutional necessity. He knew Camilla's sense of vulnerability more intimately than anyone. He also knew William's threshold on matters of trust was lower than many realized. William could forgive mistakes more easily than maneuvers. And this, from the moment he saw the man at Camilla's side, looked like a maneuver. Dinner proceeded, but only in the technical sense. Courses arrived on time. Glasses were refilled. Polite exchanges were made. Yet the true event was happening beneath the conversation. William spoke when required and only when required. Catherine carried more than her share of the visible warmth, guiding small pockets of dialogue, softening the edges, preventing the room from collapsing into open discomfort. That mattered, because a future queen is often required to hold together atmospheres she did not create. On that night, she did exactly that. Camilla, however, did not retreat into meekness. She engaged her guest with just enough openness to make clear that his presence was intentional, not reluctant. That choice only sharpened William's view of the situation. He had expected awkwardness. He had not expected defiance. The difference is crucial. Awkwardness can be forgiven as misjudgment. Defiance suggests message. And if there was one thing William could not tolerate inside a royal setting meant to project restored confidence, it was an implied message that old informal channels still had life in them. At one point, according to those familiar with the emotional shape of the evening, the guest was heard making a low remark about remembering how things used to be done. It may have been harmless. It may have been nostalgia. Yet to William, Already on edge, such language could only sound like provocation. How things used to be done was precisely the world he had been trying to close down. Blurred lines, deniable influence, sentimental loyalties, allowed to drift into constitutional spaces where they did not belong. The monarchy could survive disagreement. It could survive hurt feelings, difficult dinners, even deep private resentments, but it could not safely survive confusion over who was shaping its future. That was the real issue now. The secret guest did not need official power to be dangerous. His danger lay in symbolism. He stood for the possibility that one corner of the royal household still believed the next chapter could be managed through old habits rather than open structure. By the time dessert was served, the mood had become so strained that even seasoned staff found it difficult to maintain the illusion of effortless service. One footman later described, in careful terms to someone who then passed the impression along, that it felt as though the room had become too quiet for cutlery. That is the kind of palace phrase that sounds almost poetic until you realize what it means. It means everyone could hear silence more than conversation. The true confrontation did not happen at the table. It happened after, exactly where such things usually happen. In a smaller room, behind a closed door, once duty had performed enough for public memory. William asked to speak with his father, not later, not the next morning, then. That urgency alone told Charles the matter could not be soothed by sleep. Camilla knew what that request meant. The guest knew it too. For a moment, according to those aware of the sequence, there was discussion over whether the man should remain until the evening formally ended or be discreetly shown out. Charles chose the second option. It was a small decision, but revealing. Whatever ambiguity had existed before dinner was gone now. The guest was no longer a participant in a family evening. He had become the reason it was breaking apart. Once the door closed and the room narrowed to father and son, the language sharpened. William did not begin by insulting Camilla. He began with trust. He asked, in substance, if not in those exact words, how he was supposed to interpret the reappearance of someone deliberately removed from sensitive palace orbit. He asked whether agreed boundaries meant anything. He asked whether every effort to create a clearer, safer framework for the future of the monarchy was to be quietly challenged through surprise gestures dressed up as family hospitality. Charles tried to lower the temperature. He said it was one dinner. He said not every personal connection had to be read as institutional warfare. He said the family had become too brittle, too suspicious, too quick to turn discomfort into strategy. Under ordinary conditions, that argument might have carried weight. But these were not ordinary conditions. The room had already been poisoned by symbolism. William was past the point where soft interpretation could help. He reportedly said something that struck directly at the deeper wound. He said this was not about one guest. It was about whether the palace was still pretending that yesterday's loyalties could be allowed to blur tomorrow's crown. That line, or something close to it, captured the real conflict. This was not heir against stepmother in some petty domestic sense. It was future reign against inherited compromise. It was clarity against sentiment. It was the demand that emotional debts stop interfering with institutional design. Charles answered, as fathers sometimes do, when they have no answer that will satisfy. He defended Camilla not on procedural grounds, but on human ones. He reminded William that not every act of vulnerability should be treated as a threat. He insisted that Camilla had felt cornered, diminished, and increasingly treated as if her continued dignity depended on how little space she occupied. That mattered because it revealed the pressure Camilla had been under. She had not brought the guest back simply to provoke. She had done it, in Charles's reading, because she felt herself disappearing. William heard that, but he did not yield. The truth was more painful. He may even have agreed with part of it, yet his concern was larger. A monarchy cannot be run as emotional compensation. The institution could respect Camilla without reopening channels already judged unsafe. It could honor history without inviting it back to the table. That, in essence, was his position. And it was one Charles could resist, emotionally but not refute structurally. No one raised a voice, but the confrontation cut deeply enough that when the two men emerged, the frost had changed texture. It was no longer raw shock. It was hardened consequence. William did not return to broader conversation. Catherine joined him. Their departure, though not abrupt in a theatrical sense, came earlier than originally planned. Royal exits are messages. This one landed with the force of a warning. By morning, the palace machinery had already begun to move. Not publicly, internally. That is always how the most serious royal crises develop. The official household began collecting facts, not gossip. Who approved the guest list? When had the name been added? Which office had been informed? Whether any future-facing planning protocols had been bypassed. The official household, for those unfamiliar with the term, is the administrative system that supports the sovereign and manages the operational life of the monarchy. When it starts asking not emotional questions but procedural ones, the issue has crossed from family discomfort into institutional concern. The Lord Chamberlain's office reviewed the dinner sequence and accompanying guest clearances. Private secretaries compared notes. Advisors close to William requested assurances that no similar surprise would occur at events touching state symbolism or succession staging. Succession staging is the visual and ceremonial preparation that accustoms a nation to its next sovereign without formally declaring transition. It includes who is seen where, beside whom, and under what conditions. The secret guest had disrupted exactly that kind of staging. Camilla, meanwhile, woke to a colder realization than the previous night's confrontation alone. The issue was no longer whether William had been offended. The issue was whether the system itself was about to respond. And systems, once engaged, are far less forgiving than wounded relatives. Charles could try to soothe. Staff structures would not. She is said to have spent the morning in visible composure, but deep private distress. Those around her knew better than to crowd. If she had hoped the guest's presence would force the family to remember old loyalties, the result had been the opposite. It had convinced William that whatever soft perimeter still surrounded her circle could no longer be trusted. The silence around her that morning was not just marital discomfort, it was the sound of options closing. By midday, palace correspondents had begun sensing that something had happened. Nothing had been leaked directly, but altered schedules, clipped expressions, and one conspicuous early departure are more than enough to trigger alarm among people who spend their careers studying royal weather. Questions began quietly. Why had the private dinner ended the way it did? Why had one expected attendee vanished from view so quickly? Why were two households suddenly refusing even the usual harmless background lines? The first public hints came in the language of unexpected tension and a guest linked to former palace divisions. That was enough. Once those phrases reached the air, speculation exploded. Was there a political angle? A family angle? Had William clashed with Camilla directly? Had Charles lost control of the room? Each theory spread because each touched a broader fear that the monarchy's visible unity might be thinner than it looked. The palace tried at first to contain the matter through old methods. No denial, no confirmation, no emotional oxygen. But the problem with modern royal crises is that silence often inflames rather than calms. By afternoon, what had begun as a private dinner dispute had become a national conversation about boundaries, trust, and the future balance of power around the king. Commentators split quickly into camps. Some accused William of overreaction, arguing that one private guest should not become evidence of palace warfare. Others defended him fiercely, saying the issue was never the man himself, but the principle his presence represented. Could informal loyalties, personal debts, and hidden channels still reach the royal center without the heir's knowledge or consent? If so, what did that say about the readiness of the institution for the next era? That question struck deep, because the country has become more attentive than ever to the tension between present reign and future reign. The current king may sit on the throne, but much public emotion already leans toward what comes after. The Waleses symbolize continuity and waiting. Camilla, whether fairly or not, belongs more to the story of Charles's hard-won personal life than to the emotional imagination of the monarchy's future. The secret guest brought those two timelines into collision. Charles found himself in the most painful position of all. He now had to decide whether to treat the dinner as an unfortunate family misunderstanding or as proof that the palace required stricter internal boundaries. In private, the pressure on him mounted from both sides. Camilla needed reassurance that she was not being publicly reduced through the aftermath. William needed certainty that the old blurred world would not be permitted to return in disguised form. There was no path that did not wound someone. The second closed-door conversation between Charles and Camilla was, by all accounts, more sorrowful than angry. She is believed to have asked him whether everything around her was now to be interpreted as a threat, whether every person from her older world had become untouchable simply because William had decided the future must be sterilized of discomfort. It was a bitter word, sterilized, but an understandable one. She felt, with some justification, that her history was being treated as contamination. Charles did not fully agree, but neither could he dismiss William's case. The truth was that the monarchy had become too exposed to ambiguity. Every personal arrangement carried public meaning now. Every reunion, every invitation, every softened boundary would be read as intent. He is said to have told her that the family could no longer afford surprises where symbolism was concerned. That was the heart of it. Not morality, not revenge, surprise. Camilla's answer was devastating in its simplicity. She had not intended surprise. She had intended to be seen. That line explained almost everything. She felt herself fading into a palace structure increasingly organized around the next chapter. The guest had represented not intrigue in her own mind, but memory. He was from the period when she had fought to be recognized, when personal loyalty still felt like a shield rather than an embarrassment. She brought him because she wanted proof that her place had a history. William saw only the risk that history might try to govern the future. After that conversation, Charles made the choice that would define the aftermath. He did not condemn Camilla. He did not humiliate her. But he did order tighter controls around guest approval for events involving senior royals, especially those with succession or state-adjacent symbolism. In plain terms, no one from any former informal channel would re-enter sensitive palace spaces without review beyond personal invitation. It was a bureaucratic response to an emotional wound. That is often how monarchy protects itself. When that internal decision leaked, as such decisions always do, it confirmed to the public that the dinner crisis had been real. Broadcasters spoke of a frozen royal evening. Newspapers described the guest who reopened palace fault lines. Commentators returned again and again to the same image, William seeing Camilla's secret guest and going still. The stillness became the story, because stillness from the air implied something more serious than temper. It implied conclusion. And yet the most important scene came a few days later, at a carefully watched public engagement where all eyes were fixed on the senior royals for evidence of damage. Charles arrived first. Camilla joined him. William and Catherine followed. For a brief moment, they stood within the same frame, the kind of frame monarchies depend on in times of strain. No one smiled too broadly. No one performed exaggerated warmth. But they stood there, together, if not at ease. That visual mattered, because it told the country two things at once. First, the family was not collapsing. Second, the family had changed. The old looseness was gone. In its place was something firmer, colder, more disciplined. A settlement had been reached, but not a healing. The monarchy would move forward. It always does. The question was what it had learned from the cost. William's expression that day was composed, even gracious in the formal sense, but those who watched these things closely noted a new distance in how he carried himself around the Queen. Not disrespect, not hostility, boundary, a boundary once implied and now unmistakable. Catherine again performed the stabilizing role that history so often demands of women in royal households. She offered calm without pretending the room was warm. She gave the country a bridge over a silence no one wished to explain. Camilla, for her part, did something quietly remarkable. She did not fight the image. She did not attempt to reclaim ground theatrically. She appeared with dignity, with restraint, and with just enough composure to signal that she understood the moment required discipline from everyone. If she had lost something at that dinner, it was not merely leverage. It was the illusion that older loyalties could still move freely inside a monarchy, already bending toward its next shape. That is why this story matters, beyond the shock of one guest and one frozen glance. It was never only about who walked into a dining room. It was about the collision between memory and succession, between personal loyalty and institutional redesign, between a consort who did not want to vanish and an heir who refused to let the future remain blurred. The country saw one thing. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. William did not freeze because he was petty. He froze because in that instant, he believed he was looking at the return of a method he had spent years trying to remove from the royal bloodstream. Camilla did not bring the guest because she wanted chaos for its own sake. She brought him because she wanted her own history, her own survival, and her own emotional claim on the monarchy to be acknowledged. Charles did not fail because he lacked feeling. He failed because feeling and structure had once again collided in the one family where such collisions can shake the state itself. The monarchy could survive many things, but not uncertainty about who is allowed to shape its future. That was the lesson of the dinner. No one needed to say it publicly, because the palace said it afterward, in the only language it truly trusts: rules, reviews, approvals, and visible distance. Preparation over improvisation, clarity over sentiment, boundaries over old debts. Yet the human cost remained. A king was forced to choose order over softness. A queen consort was reminded that endurance does not guarantee influence. An heir learned that his deepest fears about old palace habits were not entirely gone. And a family once again discovered that inside royal life, even dinner can become destiny if the wrong person walks through the right door. In the end, the secret guest left quietly. The candles burned down, the silver was cleared, the staff returned the rooms to order, but nothing about the evening could be returned to what it had been before William looked up and recognized that face. The palace had tried to stage reassurance. Instead, it staged revelation. Behind the courtesies, behind the titles, behind the composed photographs that followed, a line had been crossed and then redrawn. What remained was not open warfare. It was something more royal and, in many ways, more tragic than that. It was controlled sorrow. The family stayed standing. The institution kept moving. Public duty covered private injury once again. But from that night on, everyone at the center of the monarchy knew the same thing. The age of informal indulgence was over. The future had become too important, too visible, and too vulnerable to allow hidden guests and hidden messages to pass unnoticed. And perhaps that is why the image lingers so powerfully. Not the guest himself, not even Camilla's choice, but William's stillness. That one silent pause in the middle of a carefully built evening told the whole story. The next king had seen something he believed should never have been allowed near the table again. In that moment, the old world and the coming one met under palace lights, and neither could pretend afterward that nothing had happened. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.